Now, there's been some discussion, I know by Dr. Punch, that people at Mars Hill Wind Farm in Maine have certain complaints, annoyance, some of them saying that may lead to health effects. I know that there are people who have complained at Ubley. You can also read, if you read in the internet on this subject, you can read about Vinyl Haven, Maine. You can read about Cohocton, New York. I refer to those four. The Mars Hill one is the wind farm up in northern Maine where Nissenbaum has done his work. But there's one thing in common between all four of those. The actual sound levels at people's houses in those wind farms are over 50 decibels. They're in the low 50s. They've been measured over 50 in the low 50s at Mars Hill. They've been measured over 50 in the low 50s at Vinyl Haven. They've been likely over 50 in Cohocton. They've been measured over 50 up in Ubley, in Michigan Wind 1. All of those are in a very different circumstance than the Blissfield Wind Energy Project, where we're saying that the maximum sound level would be limited to 45 decibels at the nearest non-participating occupied residence. And where does that 45 come from? I think it is supported by, first of all, EPA sound level guidelines, which are 45 decibels at night to prevent annoyance and sleep disturbance. The World Health Organization, which states, quote, at night outside sound levels should not exceed 45 dBA, and leave people can sleep with their windows open. 45 dBA to prevent sleep disturbance with the bedroom windows open. There's been a second World Health Organization document published in 2009 called Night Noise Guidelines for Europe, and that recommends a goal for European countries of 40 decibels on an annual average. Now, underline annual average there, because opponents will frequently refer to 40 decibels. You've got to have a limit of 40 decibels. But what they don't tell you is, first of all, it's not a regulation. It's not a regulated limit anywhere. It's simply a goal that has been set for European countries. But more importantly, it's not a short-term limit, like 10 minutes or an hour. You've got to meet 40 decibels. No, it's an annual average. And that makes all the difference in the world. Because an annual average implies that there's a lot of times that the sound level is going to be higher and the sound level is going to be lower. I like to give the analogy of what's the annual average speed you drive your car? Is it 70 miles an hour? No. My annual average speed is probably about 35 miles an hour. I'm backing out of my driveway, and sometimes I'm driving through town, and sometimes I'm on a local road, and other times I may be on I-94. Now, I may drive a maximum speed of 70 or 75 miles an hour. The annual average speed, because there's lots of ups and downs, is going to be like 35 or 40 miles an hour. Now, with wind turbines, we know wind turbines don't operate at their maximum power more than, say, 10 to 15% of the time. It's only a small fraction of the time that they operate at their maximum power. And so, if you look at what does an annual average goal, so let's, for the moment, let's say that we want to treat ourselves as a European country, and we want to endorse the World Health Organization's goal, not a regulation in Europe, but just a goal for those European countries of 40 decibels annual average. If you apply that to a wind turbine, it's equivalent to a 1 hour limit of 45 decibels or higher. In other words, the nighttime noise guidelines that are often cited as a reason for adopting a limit of 40 are perfectly complementary to the original World Health Organization document that recommends 45 decibels as a limit outside of a bedroom at night with the window cracked open to allow air for sleep. There's no contradiction between them. If one was writing a wind ordinance, you wouldn't write an annual average, you would write a short-term limit that you could test for, 45 decibels. So just to conclude, we believe that the 45 dBA limit for non-participating occupied structures day and night is the appropriate and health protective limit for a wind energy facility. A lower limit is unreasonable, and it would prohibit wind energy development in Palmyra and other townships. I did want to slip in one last line, and that was because Dr. Punch and his assistant, Rick James, have presented a slide comparing wind turbine sound annoyance to other transportation noise sound annoyance in different forms. We saw one tonight from Dr. Punch. In all of these graphs, we have trains, trucks, and planes, and this is decibel here, A-weighted decibels, and this is the percent highly annoying. You can go into the literature and you can see various versions of that graph. But just like the graph that Dr. Punch presented before, what you see is that transportation noise is over here, and the wind turbine line is way over on the left. And then the conclusion that's brought to you is, well, look, the wind turbine sound starts producing annoyance at a much lower level. There's something special about it. There's something that makes it very different. If you go back to the original source of that graph, it was in an article by Pt6, the Swedish researcher in 2004, you'll find a very interesting thing. And that is that the wind turbine noise and the transportation noise were plotted in different units. In other words, it was apples and oranges on the same graph. The transportation noise includes a 10 decibel penalty for nighttime noise because it's what's called a DNL, or day-night noise level. So she presented this comparison, which was really apples and oranges. And on top of that, the percent annoyance in Peterson's figures are a small slice of her data. In her studies, no more than 6% of the total people surveyed reported a high annoyance. In her first study, no more than 4% of her entire sample population reported high annoyance in her most recent study. Yet, if you look at the graph, you see numbers, oh, much, you see 20%, 30% annoyance. Well, how is that? Because she takes a very small slice of the data. And so you're fooled into thinking, well, 30% of the people in that whole sample population were annoyed. Well, that's not true. What I've done here to try and do an apples-to-apples comparison for the Planning Commission is I've taken Peterson's data from her most recent and larger survey of wind turbine annoyance, the Peterson and Way paper from 2007, and I've put it into the same units as the transportation ones so that they're plotted the same way, the DNL units. And I've plotted her points from the 2007 study here next to the airplanes, the trucks, and the trains. And what I want you to see is that wind turbine sound is really no different than other transportation sources in terms of its potential for annoyance. Yes, if it's loud enough, it will annoy people. And in fact, you know, at even a minimum level, there's a small percentage of people who are always going to be annoyed by being able to hear something that's unusual, such as a wind turbine. Thank you very much for your time. I'd be glad to answer any questions from the Planning Commission.
So, why is it that you want a difference between day and night, 55 during the day and 45 at night?
Oh, no, I wasn't suggesting that.
Okay, that's just.
I was just stating that
guidelines?
EPA in their sound guidelines for residential areas recommend 55 daytime, 45.
Was the Pierpoint, no, not Pierpoint. Ms. Baum, was that study using the same turbine that you're going to use?
No, the NISBOM study, I believe, is of Mars Hill, Maine. That is a General Electric 1.5 SLE.
How old is that?
It's an older model. You know, General Electric has more recent design models right now. The Vestas V100, in fact, is one of the newest design utility scale turbines on the market. Okay. And It has a pitch-regulated blade also that helps to prevent some of the noise that occurs, the impulse noise that occurs under high winds that has been reported in other existing wind farms that have been in operation for many years.
Does most of the sound come from the blades or from the turbine?
It depends on how close you are and what the wind speed is. It's a mixture of the two.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there I had a neighbor that watched a PBS thing down in Indiana a week or so ago, and they talked about some turbines from maybe Sweden that really don't even have moving parts in them, or I assume the generator doesn't really have many moving parts.
There's some direct drive turbines.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, is that what I'm talking about?
Could easily be. Sounds.
Yeah. What's the disadvantage to those? They don't produce enough electricity?
The gearbox is not a meaningful part of the noise that you hear. You mainly hear the gearboxes at very low wind times. When you're at your maximum sound level, most of the sound is aerodynamic.
Okay.
That is the dominance.
Okay.
And you know, there's nothing wrong with gearless wind turbines. They're perfectly fine technology. The dominant technology is gearbox driven because it is more cost effective.
Well, I guess I'm, in an effort to do apples to apples and oranges to oranges. I mean, have there been any psychological studies of pre-wind turbines and those people that have a percentage of complaints and post-wind turbines? I mean, in the 20th century, we've acclimated to a lot more sound. And so you add another piece of that, and it's almost like a cumulative effect, and all of a sudden, people are having disorders. But has there been any real research that says that these disorders were existing prior to wind turbines?
Not to my knowledge. The surveys of annoyance by Peterson, and she's published the most on it, and others have always come along, after there is a wind farm in existence, and they are prone to self-selection bias. In other words, they report the anecdotal complaints by people who are upset about being able to see and hear the wind farms. They don't go out and make sure that they get the views of everybody that lives in the community. But even if you do allow for the fact that there may be that self-selection bias, there are clearly a small percentage of the people in any population who are annoyed when wind turbines first operate. And one of the interesting things that Peterson found was that she found like a floor of 3 to 4% annoyance, no matter how quiet it got. In other words, she included in her studies people who were down to 30 decibels, and she found that between like 30 and 45 decibels, there really was not much of a relationship between the percent of annoyance and what the sound was. And once you got above 45 decibels, it really started to rise, and there was a clear relationship there. But the more interesting thing was that the people who if they could hear something, you can hear things you can hear something that's audible at a very low level sometimes, in the distance or in the background, 30, 35 decibels, there were still 3 to 4% who were annoyed. And for those people, what explained their annoyance most was not how loud was the sound they were hearing in the distance from the wind turbine, but the fact that they could see it. That people actually probably more annoyed by the visual impact, the fact that they knew it was there and they could see it. They were upset about that fact, first of all, until then when the sound level got high enough, then obviously the level of annoyance does rise, as you would expect.
I mean, we have sleep labs and they're full all the time right now. I mean, people are in sleep labs trying to be able to sleep better all the time. And it's just, it's the nature of our world. There's noise out there. That wasn't a question, it was a statement.
What's the, when you sleep at night, a person snores, what's the decibel of a person who snores at night compared to the wind turbine?
My wife is about 85, doesn't it? Because I usually leave and go to the next room. But, and the dog follows me about a minute later.
But compared to the wind turbine and the snoring, which one would be the greatest?
Well, snoring, certainly. I mean, if someone's sitting next to you, lying next to you and snoring, it's probably 70 to 80 decibels. I mean, they're inches away from you. Well, it depends on how, if they've got a nice low buzz or they got a real good snort. But, you know, that's inside sound levels. That's indoor sound levels.
Isn't that apples to oranges comparing high frequency sound to low frequency sound?
I'm just trying to